Welcome to the Molecules and Minerals podcast. I'm Steven Goldman. I'm a former trial lawyer, corporate director, executive, and a biotech investor. I'm here again today with Yuval Cohen, PhD. He's the CEO of Corbus Therapeutics Holdings, Inc., a publicly traded clinical stage biotech company trading on NASDAQ symbol CRBP. Corbus is advancing two lead investigational drugs. One is in oncology and the other for the treatment of obesity. During my last interview with Yuval Cohen, we focused on Corbus's most advanced clinical asset, CRB-701. That's a next-generation, potentially best-in-class antibody drug conjugate that targets the expression of Nectin-4 on cancer cells, which correlates highly with HPV-positive tumors. In today's podcast, we're going to focus on Corbus's other clinical investigational drug, CRB-913, which is a novel next-generation cannabinoid receptor 1 inverse agonist, that's a mouthful, which we'll simply refer to as CB1, which has been designed in such a way that it targets CB1 receptors outside the brain, nearly, although not entirely, eliminating brain exposure. As you will learn, this is a very critical feature of CRB-913, which may give it a large competitive advantage. So CRB-913 is an oral, small molecule CB1 once-a-day pill for the treatment of obesity. I want to discuss CRB-913 today because top-line results from Corbus's placebo-controlled CANYON-1 Phase 1b trial testing CRB-913 in various doses as well as a placebo group is expected to read out in September, which is only weeks away. The results, if positive, could be very significant for Corbus and its stakeholders. The CB1 receptor is a validated clinical target for obesity and related disorders. The CB1 receptor is found in abundance in the brain, but also in peripheral parts of the body, including the liver, kidney, pancreas, as well as adipose and muscle tissues. In the early 2000s, there were a number of brain-penetrant CB1 reverse agonists which were developed for the treatment of obesity, and they produced significant weight and related outcomes. The most advanced of these drugs was rimonabant, developed by Sanofi, which was approved in 2006 in 37 countries, including the European Union, but it was not approved by the FDA, which cited potential risk of increased suicidal ideation. In 2009, the European Medicine Agency withdrew authorization for rimonabant for safety reasons, and Sanofi ultimately abandoned the drug. Some years later, companies attempted once again to develop a next-generation CB1 receptor reverse agonist to treat obesity, but this time they tried to develop a drug that decreased the targeting of CB1 receptors in the brain. In 2023, Novo Nordisk acquired a CB1 reverse agonist called monlunabant, for which it paid about $1 billion. Monlunabant was able to diminish brain CB1 penetration by about 50% compared to Sanofi's rimonabant. Top-line results with monlunabant demonstrated significant weight loss, but unfortunately showed that neuropsychiatric and other side effects remain particularly high, especially at higher doses. So the safety and side effect problems with both Sanofi's rimonabant and Novo Nordisk's monlunabant puts Corbus's CRB-913 into focus. If Corbus CRB-913 can demonstrate a clean safety profile, particularly as it affects gastrointestinal and neuropsychiatric factors, as well as demonstrate weight loss, it may have a winner on its hands. And quite frankly, I don't think the market has priced in the potential of this drug at all. CRB-913 targets peripheral CB1 receptors, with only a very small percentage reaching CB1 receptors in the brain. In fact, the data suggests that CRB-913 plasma-brain ratio in the brain is 1/50th, that's 2%, of that of Sanofi's rimonabant, and about 1/15th of Novo Nordisk's monlunabant. On December 11, 2025, Corbus reported results from its double-blinded phase 1A SAD-MAD clinical trial with CRB-913. That's 14 days of testing the drug, including 7 days of treatment and 7 days of follow-up, designed to test for safety and tolerability. The results showed a very clean safety and tolerability profile with nearly no GI or neuropsychiatric events, despite careful daily testing, even at very high doses. It also showed a 2.9% weight loss, that's placebo adjusted, at day 14 in a dedicated cohort of people with obesity, although in a small number of 12 patients, which was very encouraging. Of course, the phase 1A trial tested for only 14 days in a relatively small number of patients, so caution is warranted. So CRB-913's mechanism of action is very different and independent from the very popular GLP-1 class of drugs, commonly known as Ozempic, Wegovy, and other brand names. GLP-1 drugs, while generally effective in weight loss and related issues, do have a number of serious problems. There are a significant percentage of individuals who either don't respond to GLP-1s or cannot tolerate its gastrointestinal and other side effects, or are not satisfied with the weight loss effect. There's also a pretty high dropout rate. And that's also followed generally by fairly rapid weight gain. As a result, there is a great demand in the market for a different class of weight loss drug with an independent mechanism of action with a better safety and tolerability profile. Corbus's phase 1B dose range finding study called CANYON-1 with CRB-913 was initiated in December of 2025 and follows 240 U.S. subjects with obesity randomized into 4 arms, all taking doses of CRB-913, and there's a placebo group. The doses are 20 milligrams, 40 milligrams, and 60 milligrams, and this is a treatment period of 12 weeks followed by a 4-week safety follow-up. So excitingly, top-line readout from the CANYON-1 study is now expected in September of 2026. So Yuval, thanks again for agreeing to be my guest today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So can you discuss what the issues are with the GLP-1 drugs and the emerging unmet need in the obesity landscape?
GLP-1s or incretin therapies have been transformational. They really have been. Obesity is arguably going to be the biggest health issue globally in the 21st century. In many ways, it's a testament to human ingenuity that we now have more overweight people than malnourished people on planet Earth. But with that obesity come a lot of comorbidities and an increasing cost to society as well. So GLP-1s, incretins were a game changer. They tend to work very well, but like all medications, they don't work very well for everybody, and there is no such thing as a free lunch. They have a side effect profile that is not for everyone. So if you look at this slide, you see 2 data points that pretty much talk to each other. So the one is on the left-hand side, the pie chart are the breakdown between 3 types of patients that you find on all the incretin analogs or incretin agonists out there. And those are patients that don't respond. And so it's a little bit surprising, but somewhere around 1 in 5 patients on these drugs just doesn't lose weight. The clinical definition is a weight loss inferior to 5%. And so you can imagine these people are on the drugs and nothing is happening. So for them, there is a clear unmet medical need. What's interesting is if they don't respond to one type of GLP-1 drug, they tend to not respond to another type of GLP-1. There's something about their maybe genetic composition that makes them immune to the function of these drugs. A bigger pool are people who lose weight, and they're very happy that they're losing weight, but the adverse events, usually gastrointestinal, are just too much. They can't tolerate it, and they just drop out. And then the last pool of patients are those who do lose weight. And even there is a range. There are those who lose a very satisfactory amount of weight and they're happy and their physician's happy. There are those who don't lose enough weight as far as they're concerned or as far as their physician recommends. And so even there is a gamut of experiences. Where that translates to is on the right-hand side is a statistic that is eerily similar, whether it's Novo Nordisk or Eli Lilly or third-party research. Everyone has published very similar data, which is that in the first year of being on a drug like this, and the first year is where it's easiest to measure, patients who start the year with a prescription, so they have a prescription, they start the drug, only a third of them, just a bit more than a third, actually finish the year still on the drug. Now, one of the intriguing things as an aside, Stephen, is it's not a cost issue primarily. And we know this for a bunch of reasons. Anecdotally, people who are obese will sacrifice a lot financially to take the weight off, and that's very appropriate and sensible and understandable. But one of my favorite was an academic study that was conducted in which the drugs were given for free. And so there really wasn't a financial burden whatsoever. The dropout rates were nearly identical. So it really boils down to the dropout rate you're seeing there are, to paraphrase, I'm not responding to the drug. I'm responding, but I cannot tolerate it. Or I'm responding, but not enough. Or it worked, but I don't really want this for the rest of my life. Or it's a bit too much a year into it. That type of gamut. And that's normal. There is no drug out there that fits everybody. And so in here is an opportunity for a very different type of drug. And the term that we will use in today's conversation a lot, Stephen, is orthogonal. It's a mechanism of action which targets something completely different. And the idea of an orthogonal mechanism of action is that it provides the potential openings to a bunch of things. One, someone that doesn't respond to the GLP-1 pathway may respond to an orthogonal pathway, right? The chances of them not responding to either are probably quite low. Someone who cannot tolerate the GLP-1 pathway might be able to tolerate a different mechanism. There is a very exciting potential for combination. Very, very interesting things happen in pharma typically when you combine orthogonal mechanisms of action because they don't cancel each other. And last but not least is, for me personally, the most intriguing opportunity in obesity, regardless of Corbus or whatnot, which is on the whole, we have now a drug mechanism, this GLP-1, especially the injectables, that for many, 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 many people is very efficacious in losing weight. The challenge then becomes, Stephen, okay, you've lost the weight. You're 6 months into it or 12 months into it. That's usually when it sort of evens out. What now? And as you mentioned in your introduction, like any medication that causes an effect, this is not curative. If you take away the medication, you will regain weight. You will go back to where you started. That's perfectly normal. And so the question then for people who have lost weight, even very successfully on the GLP-1, is what happens now for the rest of their lives? They are now stable. They've reached a weight that they wanted to reach. How do you then manage lifelong maintenance? And that's where safety and tolerability are especially important. If we think of drugs off the top of our heads that so many of us use as lifelong chronic medication, we think of drugs like statins or proton pump inhibitors, etc. And one of the hallmarks of those drugs is they're, on the whole, very, very easy to tolerate. Drugs that are hard to tolerate are usually incompatible with chronic usage. Okay, that was a long answer to a very good question, but I hope that was informative.
That was terrific. So, in my introduction, I talked about Sanofi's experience with its drug, which ultimately had to be withdrawn. Maybe you could expand on the development of that drug the parts that were effective and the parts that were problematic, and I guess how your drug kind of addresses the problematic aspects of the drug.
So this story is so fascinating. We actually, about 2 or 3 years ago, published a review of this story. We were going to call it Who Framed Rimonabant Rabbit, but we decided that was a little bit betraying our age. But it was something along the lines of revisiting Rimonabant 17 years after, you know. The story is fascinating, and it's one of those where you have facts and then you also have a narrative. And it's one of those stories where they remind us that narrative is so incredibly powerful. So 20 years ago, 2006, Stephen, if we were having this conversation and you asked me, so what's the hottest thing in pharma at the moment? One of the top three hot areas in pharma would have been the rise of these new metabolic drugs that target metabolic diseases called CB1 inverse agonists. And many, many, many big pharma were in there. As you can see on this little chart only shows the one that were in the clinic. There's a bunch of other big pharma that were starting programs that were just not in the clinic yet. And all of these drugs were very, very similar. They targeted, as you pointed out, the CB1 receptor. They were inverse agonists. And maybe, Stephen, at some stage in our conversation, we'll talk about, that's a very strange sounding term. What is an inverse agonist? And all of them targeted this receptor called CB1 in the brain that had been known even by that stage to be a very important receptor in metabolism. And what's interesting is all of them worked. So you mentioned in your introduction that this was clinically validated. It's clinically validated in the sense that every single CB1 inverse agonist ever tested in obese patients has led to weight loss. So it is one of the most predictable mechanisms of action we can think of in pharma. So what on earth happened? How did it go from visions or dreams of this super class of new drugs in 2006 to an entire class being abandoned nearly overnight? And what happened was a series of unfortunate events, as one says. Rimonabant, Sanofi, the French company, was the first one to win the race. It was a very tight race. They were the first to cross the finish line with a drug called Rimonabant. And in 2006, again, hindsight is so interesting here. In 2006, it was one of the darlings of pharma. It had been approved in the EU. It was actually approved ahead of schedule. There wasn't a whiff of adverse event risks involved in it. The European Medicines Authority or agency was very, very pleased with it. And champagne bottles were popping, as it were. And then just a year later, everything changed. And what changed was Sanofi took pretty much the same data set they had taken to the Europeans. They took it to the FDA. And it's one of those events where every single thing that could have gone wrong seemed to have gone wrong. And to be fair, from both sides of the dialogue, FDA was at a time where, quite rightly, they were very concerned about adverse events. This follows, if you, Stephen, you would remember this for sure, the sort of the scandal of fen-phen. It was a period of time where there was a very widespread concern around safety in drugs, in newly approved drugs. So FDA was particularly defensive, rightly or wrongly. And they had also instituted a particular focus on this rather new field of psychiatric adverse events. And it's one of those where perhaps, once you have a hammer, you look for nails. And be that as it may, they offered a series of very sort of specific questions to Sanofi around the potential risk of psychiatric adverse events. It was not just a Sanofi dialogue. Many, many, many other big pharmas with many divergent drugs that were walking into FDA during that period were encountering the same questions. Where the wheels really fell off was Sanofi, and I think it's fair to say, were overly aggressive with FDA. It was a very contentious dialogue. And I say that because pretty much at the same time, for example, Pfizer, Stephen, walk in with a drug that, again, you would remember, Chantix, the first ever smoking cessation drug, pretty much the only smoking cessation drug. Very similar questions, very different outcome, and it's worth juxtaposing it. Sanofi sort of butt heads with FDA, and as a result, they are shown the door. And then everybody being the rest of pharma, has a very strong and negative reaction, and the entire class is abandoned. Pfizer with Chantix have exactly the same dialogue, very different tone, to Pfizer's credit. And what Pfizer say to FDA is, you know what? Sensible questions, sensible concerns. How about you give us a black box warning? And in the meantime, we will repeat a large study, a phase 4 study, to examine whether these risks of neuropsychiatric adverse events are founded or not. And then we'll come back to you, FDA, with the results. And they did that. They ran a study with 8,000 smokers. And it showed that there were no adverse events related to no psychiatric adverse events, and the black box was lifted. Again, to be fair, this is all in hindsight, and we cannot change the past. But what happened was this very negative stigma was created around these brain penetrant CB1 inverse agonists, rightly or wrongly. They will never be able to be restored, again, rightly or wrongly. But the path forward came from NIH, as is often the case, with a very simple proposition, which is, what if we take the same approach but just keep it out of the brain? And as you pointed out in your introduction, they really are two sort of super libraries of compounds. One of them ended up with Novo Nordisk through Inversago. The other one ended up at Corbus. And now it was really a question of how much exclusion from the brain, how much do you need to be out of the brain in order to reach a balance between two things? The drug still needs to work. And on the other hand, you need to have a marked reduction in psychiatric adverse events. And that brings us to the present. Monlunabant, as you pointed out, is less brain penetrant, but only by about 50%. And again, in hindsight, it looks like that was not enough. They still had a very uncomfortable level of psychiatric adverse events. They maintain their efficacy. Their efficacy actually is very, very satisfactory. But it's hard to understand or to imagine monlunabant moving forward, at least in the current dosages. And as you mentioned, Novo may or may not be re-examining that. Now come we with CRB-913. We are, to the best of our knowledge, by far the most brain-excluded CD1 inverse agonist ever tested. So as a research tool, that's going to be very informative. And Stephen, it's the same two questions that are coming up in September when we have our data. The first question is going to be, does it still work? We will see weight loss. And I say this because every one of these has shown weight loss. And even in our very, very short MAD study, and in a tiny number of patients, we saw a pretty strong signal of weight loss. And in animals, we see weight loss, etc. So I'm not worried about the weight loss. The question is, how much? Is it competitive weight loss? Monlunabant is highly competitive in its weight loss. Are we going to be as competitive? So that's important. And the second question, perhaps even more important, is, as you pointed out, Stephen, are we clean? Now, it's important to define what the word clean here from neuropsych means. We know a lot about neuropsych, also thanks to GLP-1 studies. There have been so many and so big, and they test everything that we have to test. All obesity drugs have to monitor for neuropsychiatric adverse events. That is the sort of legacy of rimonabant from 20 years ago. It's still with us. And so it's actually relatively straightforward to compare between different studies. And we have the numbers, and the question, therefore, the answer to the question of what is the normal level of psychiatric adverse events with a GLP-1 in a clinical study, And the answer is it hovers at about 14%. None of them's horrific. It's rare for them to be really, really bad, but it's sort of, think of it as almost a background noise that emerges during a randomized controlled study in obesity patients. And you're looking at something that hovers around 14%. It can be as low as 8% and as high as 18%, depending on the drug and depending on the study. Where was monlunabant? Why is monlunabant a problem? So you've got, say, an average of 14%, which is quote unquote the normal. Monlunabant came in at almost 40%. 40 is not the same as 14. It is markedly more. Interesting enough, the quality were the same. It's not that the types of adverse events were worse. There was just so many more of them. And so when we think about what does good look like, what is feasible, what is a way forward, roundabout where GLP-1 lands is good. It's very unlikely that we're going to be safer than a GLP-1. That would be quite astonishing, I'll be honest with you. The last one is on gastrointestinal adverse events. And again, what helps us are the past data that we have on that class of CB1 inverse agonists. Even monlunabant, the GLP-1s, they're very significant side of their action, not exclusively, but a significant part of what they do, Steven, happens in your guts. And on a very simplistic level, what they do, which is so efficacious, is they make food to travel more slowly through your guts. And that's actually a fantastic way and a very effective way of reducing your appetite. You feel full because your food takes longer to pass through you. But that means you get many more GI adverse events, right? CB1 doesn't do that. There's not a lot of CB1 in the guts. And as you pointed out in the introduction, it's more in the organs of metabolism or food storage. So what do we metabolize with? We absorb food through the gut, but we metabolize and store food through the pancreas, our liver, our muscles, our massive sites of energy storage, and of course, fat cells, these adipocytes. So CB1s have always been much milder than GLP-1s on the gut. We'll see what we get, but I don't think it's going to be a particular shocker if we come in more tolerable on the GI than the GLP-1s.
Okay. I put up a slide from your June presentation, and maybe you can discuss the trial design.
It's a classic SAD-MAD. So SAD-MAD is a terrible acronym. SAD stands for single ascending dose. MAD stands for multiple ascending doses. And the way to think of it is think of it as a ladder or staircase. So let's start with a SAD. With a SAD, what you do to a volunteer, usually a healthy volunteer, is for just 1 day, you give them 1 dose of your drug. And then as you progress through your SAD study, each group of healthy volunteers on their 1 day of drug dosing gets a higher and higher and higher and higher dose of the drug. You typically dose to much, much higher levels than you'll ever dose in the clinic otherwise. You're trying to push the envelope, Stephen. That's what you're doing in a SAD-MAD study. So to put it in perspective, 600 milligrams of our drug is 30 times more than our initial dose in the clinic, for example. It's a gargantuan dose, which is normal. The MAD is the same ladder, but now instead of just a single dose in a day and then you go home, now you are giving multiple doses in a sequential series of days. In our case, 7 days, which is pretty classic for MAD. One of the hallmarks of SAD-MAD studies is typically, not always, but typically, they're done in what's called in clinic, Stephen. So usually your victims here, as it were, are students, college students looking for some pocket money. And they volunteer to stay for a week or 2 in a clinic. Think of it as a very fancy hospital, and you give them this experimental drug. And it's very nice of them. And every day you collect lots of vital signs and urine and stools and blood, etc., and measure their pulse. They really are in basically a human laboratory. And so what we did was very standard, done in what's known as a phase 1 unit and done in the US. So nothing out of the ordinary in this one. The only thing that's a tiny bit exotic, and that's more unique to obesity, is we included in both the SAD and the MAD portions of it one extra group of volunteers who were obese. There's a bunch of reasons you do it. The main reason you do it, Stephen, is people living with obesity have a different metabolism, right? Someone who weighs, say, 300 pounds has a different metabolism than someone who weighs 150 pounds. It's normal. There's just more of that person. Their metabolism tends to be slower. It's part of the reason they may be overweight. And so you want to make sure that what's known as the pharmacokinetics of your drug, and for that matter, the safety of your drug, looks similar, or at least you have a feel for it, not just in a healthy volunteer, which again tends to kind of be a college student, but also in a patient or in a volunteer that reflects the patient population that ultimately the drug will be used for.
Okay. And I see the obese group, if I can use that term,
Yep.
they were given 150 mgs in the MAD study, and there's a note here on the SAD part of the study as well.
Correct. So you typically wouldn't do an entire staircase of obese in parallel. That's a little bit of an overkill. You choose a dose that makes sense to you, and then you will simply compare that dose, say 150 milligrams, to the parallel dose in the cohort that is not exclusively obese. Now, as an aside, interesting enough, in our study, and it's perhaps a reflection of the society we live in, normal healthy volunteers in the United States these days are not exactly quite as skinny as you would think. It also has to do with where you do the study. And so while our obese cohort, their BMIs, if I remember, had to be, or on average, I think 36. 36 is someone who is well into the realms of obese. Even our normal healthy volunteers, their average BMI was 28.
I put a slide up. This is slide 42 from your presentation. And this shows the weight loss observed in the obese group who were given 150 mgs per day. And it looks like on the left side of the slide, every single one of them who was actually given the 150 mgs dose lost weight.
Yep.
And the 3 placebo patients all gained a little bit of weight after 14 days.
That's pretty normal. In a very comfortable hospital unit, a sort of a medical hotel room, there's not much to do. And so you're watching television or you're reading a book, you're nibbling on delicious snacks, and invariably you are going to gain some weight.
If you're on the placebo, but the ones on drug actually showed a 2.9% average placebo-adjusted weight loss.
And that's where it gets a little bit interesting, which is, albeit small number of patients or volunteers, albeit a short period of time, what we saw was every one of them who was on our experimental drug did not behave like placebo. They started to lose weight. And if you go to the next slide for a second, Stephen.
Yeah, I will.
What you'll see is it's not a fluke that happens sort of at the last day. It really is very, very sustained decline in weight day by day by day, starting pretty much from the beginning of the study. The first point there is day 2. In other words, what you're seeing here is the weight loss compared to the day before. Monlunabant, by the way, saw the same thing. Monlunabant had a very, very, very early rapid weight loss. I'm trying to remember, 95% or so of patients on monlunabant lost weight, some weight. That's unusual. That's a pretty potent signal. Our study was minuscule, but even with monlunabant, there were not a lot of patients who were quote unquote resistant to monlunabant. That's really intriguing.
The next slide, this is actually a pretty important slide as well. Maybe you can explain this.
Sure. So here, remember, we only had one cohort, Stephen, of volunteers who had to be obese. In other words, to get into the study, they had to all be obese. But the rest of those, if you remember that staircase that we talked about, were open to any healthy volunteer. Being overweight or even obese is not an exclusion criteria. They're allowed to be overweight or obese as long as they're otherwise healthy. And so what we have here is a little bit of an inkling of what's called a dose response, right? We have 3 doses that we're looking at: 25, 75, and 150 that are dosed daily. This is not the exclusively obese cohort, but because on average, these patients were not exactly skinny, we can see some weight loss. And in fact, if you look at that dotted line, the horizontal dotted line, anyone below it, so they're losing weight, was overweight to begin with. The volunteers who did not lose weight tended to be, to begin with, skinny or normal. And so what do we see here? We see an inkling of a dose response, right? Our lower dose, the 25 milligram dose, is not showing quite as much weight loss as the 75 and 150. And that's what you would like to see, right? You want to see in drug development that there is a dose that your drug doesn't work because there's not enough of it. And on the other side of it, Stephen, there's always a dose beyond which it doesn't work any better, right? Either you've saturated the system or it's intolerable. Either way, what you see in drug development is what's known as an S curve. There's a flat bit where it doesn't work, then there's a linear bit where it works really, really well, and then there's another flat bit where it plateaus again.
Okay, and then this slide, this is a comparison with orforglipron, and maybe you can explain what this slide means.
Sure. So orforglipron to your audience may be more recognizable with its recent launch with its commercial name. It's Foundayo. It is the oral GLP-1 from Eli Lilly. It's the first ever what's known as a GLP-1 agonist. It is a small molecule. Oral Wegovy, Stephen, is different. It's the peptide that you inject into your belly once a week, given as a daily. But Foundayo or orforglipron is the first ever small molecule that you can swallow and does the work of a GLP-1 drug. And so, in a sense, that's what we need to think about starting to compare ourselves to. We are a daily oral pill for hopefully for weight loss. What else is out there that you would use as an oral daily pill for weight loss? I should point out, just to make sure the audience is aware of it, it is always tricky comparing between clinical studies, right? This is not the same clinical study. So a big caveat around that. Having said that, it's always informative, right? Within reason, understanding it's not the same clinical study, the patients may or not be different, etc. But what's interesting about our data, and monlunabant, again, is very similar to this in a bigger scale, in a longer study, is the weight drop is rapid, is surprisingly rapid. One of the challenges of GLP-1s is you cannot give them the maximum dose immediately. You have to titrate patients. And so it takes longer to kick in. And so that's really interesting in order to sort of the immediacy of the weight loss that we saw.
So here's an important slide. This is slide 46 of your June presentation. This is the MAD data, the very important safety data. And also,
Yep.
as I understand it, during your phase 1A trial, when the patients were in the clinic, I understand they were monitored daily for neuropsychiatric symptoms, etc.
They were, which is something you would not do in a real world clinical study in the same way that, for example, well, we check their weight every morning. You take their blood every morning. Remember, they are effectively in a human lab. The reason this slide is important, again, is to contextualize, is to understand our drug is not in limbo. It has to be put in context of what else is out there. And in this case, what we're comparing it is not monlunabant. It's not the CB1 from Novo. It's what's out there that's quite literally out there that you can pick up from the pharmacy, right? Orforglipron, as I said, Foundayo, you can get a prescription for it. And we look at 2 things. The one is, if you remember earlier in our conversation, we talked about how CB1 inverse agonists have a milder gastrointestinal tolerability profile. And you can see comparing our short study to one of the short studies from orforglipron. And this is not really surprising. CB1 inverse agonism is not associated, especially not so much with the vomiting and nausea, which are the most challenging things for patients on GLP-1s. And then there's the neuropsych. Now, these are very short studies, so we're comparing one to the other. We're looking at sort of the validated questionnaires. If you remember, Stephen, earlier in our conversation, I mentioned that what's normal is about 14%. 14% are neuropsychiatric adverse events that are prompted by the patient. The patient goes, you know what, funny enough, last night I couldn't sleep, or last week I had anxiety. What you see here is questionnaires that are validated. They try and catch much more severe adverse events, and we were negative as is orforglipron for that. That's
very interesting. And then here is the next slide, 47, which I guess is contextualizing weight loss at 2 weeks.
That's exactly it.
But it just gives some, I guess, hint of the effectiveness of CRB-913.
Again, all the wonderful caveats we talked about, but still, it's to give you like you said, a hint or a flavor of what are we talking about? And we look at very short studies. Typically, these are MAD studies from these other drugs. And you can see that one of the challenges of GLP-1s is because you have to titrate them so relatively slowly, they just take a while to kick in. We're not trying to convey here that we expect to be more potent than they are. There's nothing at the moment that is more potent than tirzepatide, for example, the injectable Eli Lilly dual agonist. It is massively, massively powerful. But the idea is if we look at oral GLP-1 inverse agonists that tend to not be quite as strong as the injectable stuff, what we can start to get a feel for, as did monlunabant, is we seem to be at a minimum in the same ballpark. That has to be validated in our case in this longer in CANYON-1. CANYON-1 will give us a very good idea. What's interesting about monlunabant, Stephen, is, and I mentioned before that it's effective, just to quantify how effective it is, we have data for monlunabant for a 1-year study. To give you an idea of how potent it is, monlunabant is more potent than Fundayo. Not by a lot, but it's measurably more potent. And it's probably right up there, touching the same potency as the oral semaglutide. So if we think of those drugs as very successful commercial weight loss, oral weight loss drugs, monlunabant can hold its head up high. It is smack bang in there. It is not an inferior efficacy. So from an efficacy perspective, monlunabant is doing very, very well. We will see how similar we are to that. And that's what we'll find out in September.
I had reviewed your preclinical mice data. And what was interesting is how well it works with other weight loss drugs.
Yep. These are the standard mice obesity models that we all use in our industry. And if you remember, we talked about one of the really neat things about orthogonal mechanisms of action is usually they can play very nicely in the same sandbox. And so what we showed, for example, with our drug, and Novo showed with their drug, by the way, is that in mice, at least, when we combine, both companies separately combined our drugs with GLP-1s, what we got was additive. The big question is, will this additivity translate also in humans? So for example, Stephen, what would happen if you took an obese individual and gave them both orforglipron, so both Fundayo or oral Wegovy, and the CB1 inverse agonist, either our drug or monlunabant? And what the mice are telling us, and the mice tend to be pretty predictable in obesity, is they should lose more weight than just if they were to be done separately. And so imagine with, let's take again monlunabant because we have that data. So Fundayo is about a 10% weight loss. Monlunabant's about almost 13% weight loss. It stands to reason that if you were to combine the two, I would not be surprised if you would end up somewhere with a combined 20% or so weight loss.
At a year out.
In fact, the way to think about it is where does it flatten out, which is typically about a year to a year plus. And the reason that's exciting is the oral GLP-1s have a built-in limitation. They are not as efficient as the injectable GLP-1s. And it has to do with their GI adverse events that are worse. And so if you could take an oral GLP-1, add another mechanism to it, and now be in the same ballpark as an injectable GLP-1, that's certainly very helpful, again, for those patients out there who are losing weight but need to lose more. The next slide, again, in mice, is what ultimately may end up being the biggest chunk of and the biggest unmet need in obesity, which is what do you do with, Stephen, a 35-year-old obese individual? They have lost the weight now through particularly an injectable incretin analog. They are now at the weight that is appropriate for them. They are now, say, 37 years old. 2 years have lapsed. And they hopefully have decades and decades and decades of life left to them. What do you do with them? Do you keep injecting them every week for the rest of their lives? For some of them, that might be appropriate, but there's a goodly amount, and my guess is a majority of them, that's just a challenge. That is not easy. It's not only the injection, it's the adverse events that come with it, etc. And so the ability to switch then to every morning, I just take a pill, and just like I would take a statin or a proton pump inhibitor, I don't even think about it, and I don't feel any different. The only thing the patient will feel is they're not regaining weight. That's it. They're not going to lose more weight. They've lost the weight already. When they started the maintenance, they've reached the right weight. And so we can do that in mice. And recently, Lilly showed that Fundayo can do that after injectable Wegovy. It's good enough for them. The problem with there, though, is the adverse events did not change. So what you exchanged was a weekly injection for a daily pill, which is important, but the adverse events were basically identical. There was no relief from the adverse events.
This is, again, some additional data from your mouse model as well in preclinical. And again, shows what you were talking about as well.
Here, the interesting thing about this one is why do they lose weight? And GLP-1s do the same thing. You lose weight because you eat less, and the first thing you do is you burn fat. What's interesting here is, so there are 3 bars here on this slide. The left-hand most is vehicle, which is a fancy way of saying placebo in animals. And so they just maintain their fat. They've not lost weight. They're not giving them anything that makes them lose weight. The middle bar, the minus 3.63%, those are animals that were on semaglutide, also known as Ozempic or Wegovy, and they lost weight and they burned fat, right? They lost fat. What was intriguing was when we took those animals that are already halfway to being skinny, as it were, and now replaced the GLP-1 with a CB1 inverse agonist, ours, they lost even more fat. And that's the orthogonal bit of it. So there seems to be a second now new mechanism that's been introduced to this animal that burns even more fat that had not been eliminated by the GLP-1. Again, animal models are wonderful. We'll see what happens in humans. The most important thing in obesity as a therapeutic or as an area of therapy is first and foremost the weight loss. Everything that's sort of downstream of that is, as long as it's healthy weight loss, is secondary. And fat is the healthy weight loss. You don't want to lose weight from burning, for example, excessive muscle mass.
Perhaps you could add some additional information about numbers. If successful, what do you see the addressable market size being?
When it comes to obesity, the numbers just become very hard to wrap our heads around. So Eli Lilly, for example, recently stated that they believe that the total global population of patients suffering from obesity who can afford or have access to prescription medication stands at about 500 million people. Well, the moment that's your overall population, all the other fractions of that number are just kind of absurd. They're not absurd because they're not real. We're not used to those types of numbers. And so let's focus on the percentages rather than what they are, the overall size of the pie. But yeah, it's like we talked about before. It's this breakdown between intolerant and sensitive responders, but within the responders, there'll be those who need to lose weight. What I will say is I'm adamant, and I think the data out there supports this hypothesis. The future of obesity treatment for the vast majority of obese individuals is going to be an oral pill. That doesn't mean that the injectables are going away. There are always going to be people for whom you need a very potent weight loss. We now have the advent of not just the double acting GLP-1s, the triple acting ones, and they do lead to even more weight loss. But the vast majority of obese individuals are categorized by two things. They want to take a pill, they don't want to get injected. And the second thing, Stephen, is an interesting one. And there have been multiple studies on this. The average desired weight loss of a person in the United States on a GLP-1 drug is about 10%. We think about the 20 and 30%, but those really are appropriate for morbidly obese individuals, right? If your BMI, Stephen, is in the 40s and sometimes in the 50s, then 10% is not going to take you much. It's better than nothing, but you're still going to end up being morbidly obese after 10% weight loss. But that's a smallish number of patients. And for those patients, if anything, as a segue, when they do lose that weight, they're going to be turfed over for bariatric surgery. It's just a question of losing enough weight so that they can be operated on. The vast majority of overweight people in the United States and probably worldwide are people whose BMI are north of 28 or north of 30. They are technically obese, but they're not morbidly obese, right? Their obesity is not impacting their ability to work and enjoy life, etc. But they are overweight. They really do need to lose that weight for long-term health. Their self-image may be suffering, etc., but they can still go to work. They can still drive a car. People who are morbidly obese, that really is almost a form of disability. That's a very different type of person. And for those, the key is going to be how easy it is for me to take this drug and how easy it is for me to tolerate this drug.
That'll be the big one. So I've taken you to the next slide, which is really a summary of the actual CANYON-1 trial, which is going to read out soon in September.
Yeah. Yep.
So can you just kind of go over it quickly, what
Sure.
we're looking for and what does success look like?
Yeah, bottom line, it's very similar to the Monlunabant study. It's very similar to phase 1B or phase 2 studies in obesity. There really isn't anything particularly exotic. It's a larger study. It's, 240 patients, so we'll be able to understand what's going on. And it's for a goodly number of months. So it's not short, it's not tiny. What does good look like? Let's start with weight loss. If we compare ourselves to the oral GLP-1s, anything above 4% placebo adjusted is certainly respectable. That's where you want to be. Because remember, it's only 3 months. It's not a year-long study. And then if we look at safety, as we discussed before, GI adverse events shouldn't be worse than a GLP-1. It's highly unlikely that there'll be that. The big one is what is neuropsych? And as we said, neuropsych, it's got to be as good as a GLP-1. And a GLP-1 is on average about 14%.
Okay, so that's very important. One of the things that I did not ask you about was your intellectual property. So if you're successful, what kind of moat do you have intellectually for your drug?
So that's the nice thing about small molecules. And so you have the classic moat of what's known as composition of matter, Stephen, right? The chemistry involved in it. The method of use, what do you do with a small molecule? And then you start with sort of the picket fence around that, which are things like formulation, synthesis, etc. CRB-913, dates back to, I think, about 2 years ago, sounds about right. And with, on average, 20 years of patent life, we're looking at a goodly amount of years in the clinic. We, like Novo Nordisk, have an entire library of compounds. And so if it's successful, one could envision sort of years and years and years worth of follow-on compounds, iterations, improvements.
Okay, well, that's it sounds like a fair bit of intellectual property, and I assume that you've been very careful with that.
Yeah, and it's how different they are from that first generation that really sort of opens that possibility.
The data is coming soon. I know in Novo Nordisk trial with monolunabant, they actually had quite a number of patients that dropped out. I guess that was the side effects. You haven't reported on anything like that. I guess we'll find out about any dropouts in September. Is there anything else you want to talk about CRB-913?
It should be really interesting. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And it's, in that case, it's pretty much, I think, the last hurrah, in a sense that if our level of brain exclusion doesn't work, then it's hard to imagine having something even more excluded from the brain than we have. If it does work, then a couple of things. One, first of all, it's a comeback story, and everybody loves a comeback story. It's a sensible comeback story. In other words, someone came up with a class of drugs, there was a problem, figured out what the problem was, engineered the problem out, and then he moved forward. There's something intellectually very satisfying about it. The second thing about it is, if it does work, it really is highly differentiated. I cannot emphasize enough. At the moment, out there in pharma land, there really isn't any other mechanism that we are aware of that leads to weight loss other than CB1 when comparing to GLP-1. There are other mechanisms being explored in obesity, and they do weird and wonderful and hopefully very exciting things. For example, there are mechanisms to protect muscle loss and maybe accelerate metabolic something or other, but they don't actually lead to weight loss. Currently, today, if we have a chance of something orthogonal that leads to weight loss, the only thing on the horizon is a CB1 inverse agonist. And then the last thing is, if the data is encouraging, if it's actionable, if it's moving forward, what do we do as a company? And what I've said many times is, the first thing we have to do is we have to talk to big pharma, because we have to understand from them, Stephen, what would they want to do with this drug moving forward? It doesn't mean that they'll do something in terms of a partnership or not. That's unpredictable. But at a minimum, we need to make sure that the next study we plan is one that strikes big pharma as sensible. And that's very, very important. So hopefully we get there. And if we do, I think those will be really fascinating discussions.
I'm sure. So, have you had any sort of even preliminary discussions with Big Pharma about this? I mean, clearly your phase 1A data was promising, albeit small numbers, etc.
I think all we can say publicly, and it's appropriate and I think predictable, is this is not some sort of an exotic mechanism of action. This is a mechanism of action that is highly, highly familiar, and familiarity is very helpful in these types of conversations. Um, it is conceptually, Stephen, easier to have a conversation that goes, hey, remember that mechanism all you guys are working on? Well, we engineered something out of it, versus, hey, here's a mechanism of action you've never seen before, never been described before. It's we're the first one ever to do it. The latter is a lot more complicated than the former to have a conversation. But it like everything else in our industry, appropriately so, it's all about the data. And what's nice about CRB-913 and the CB1 inverse agonist is we know it's very easy for us to speculate what good looks like, because we understand the blemishes of the past.
CRB-913 actually shares that in a way with CRB-701. Both have addressed kind of well-known targets that had some problems with it in terms of safety and tolerability. And in each of these drugs that you're advancing, you come up with the next generation, safer, more tolerable, more efficacious, potentially, drugs.
Precisely. We are not particularly adventurous. We like to look at something where you go, hey, there is a chance for an incremental but very impactful improvement
Yeah.
versus here's something no one's ever done before.
So, from a valuation point of view, from an investor looking at Corbus as an investment overall, I know I'm an investor, and my primary reason for investing was your CRB-701 drug because it's more advanced. You're starting a registrational trial, etc. And I've read various analyst reports on Corbus, and I think they share that view. So, in a way, CRB-913, I look at as a potential upside, an option in the value of Corbus. I don't know whether you look at it that way as well. And I mean, obviously, it's going to be binary. It's either going to have that safety profile you're looking for, or it doesn't. Do you share that point of view about the impact of this? If the drug works, if you have a successful CRB-913 CANYON-1 trial result in September, I think it could materially impact the value of Corbus. But if it fails, I don't know that anyone has really priced in very much value to the drug.
I'm not an investor.
How about the feedback you've been getting from investors?
I think what you presented is a very, very fair representation of what the majority of investors are telling us. In other words, the majority of investors are telling us they think of us as an oncology company with this interesting, some of them phrase it as interesting call option in obesity. I think it's sensible because we do need to be very objective about it. This is a mechanism of action that has a very, very significant historical blemish on it. It's one of those, Stephen, especially with your background as a lawyer, it's one of those sort of guilty until proven innocent. I think it's very sensible. Why? The onus is on the compound to prove itself that it is not like its predecessors. I think that what's exciting is, and it does happen in pharma, not very often, but when it does happen, it's kind of wonderful to see, is when a class sort of was deemed unsolvable and something comes out of the class and suddenly changes everything. And the example that comes to mind are the JAK2 inhibitors, for example, in inflammation, which were really just deemed doomed. That's it. They were considered too toxic. Not one of them got to the market. It was a very, very expensive episode. And then somebody just engineered it out. And now there are quite a few of them and they're incredibly successful, but not by chance. Somebody had to figure something out. Like I said, when it happens, it's intellectually very satisfying.
What's interesting, just on the valuation side, just speaking as an investor, is the fact that Novo paid $1 billion for monlunabant just a couple of years ago, and that was just a phase 1 asset at the time. So if CRB-913 is successful, it's basically solved the problem that monlunabant has faced. So in my own mind, a successful trial should be worth some considerable amount of dollars.
The number that is even more astonishing, Stephen, perhaps irrationally so, I'll be honest. The day in September 24 that Novo issued the press release that basically, quote unquote, doomed monlunabant, there was a press release in which they said, look, it's not working like we thought it was working, and there are issues around safety. That day, Novo lost $32 billion in market cap. Now, part of it is completely irrational, right? The program could not possibly have been worth that much. It was 32 times more than they actually bought it for. But I do think that some of it was certainly an expectation priced in to the Novo stock that they had a chance at having a completely orthogonal drug that nobody else had, especially not their strongest competitor, which is Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly has yet to invest in CB1 asset. And so that sort of gives a little bit of a speculative, of course, flavor to how big of a deal is it if we did have an orthogonal weight loss drug, the GLP-1 class, especially one that is a daily oral pill. And it's probably quite a big deal. Again, whether that's this drug or another, time will tell and data will tell. But weight loss, this $60 billion in sales and increasing market, is concentrated around one relatively small family of very, very similar receptors in a very, very specific pathway in the body. That's not for everyone. And so I think that's what's really exciting.
Well, I guess we're soon going to find out. And assuming you have successful results, which are not guaranteed, of course, but if you do have successful results, I think you'll soon see how much attention you get from Big Pharma.
We are certainly very, very gratified by the level of engagement we've seen from a variety of audiences. But yes, ultimately, let's see what the data looks like. As you said, it's the study is nearly completed. Once the last patient has had their last visit, there's a bunch of sort of mechanical things you do in a study. You clean up blinded data, then you lock the database, and then you do whatever other cleanup needs to be done. But yeah, sometime probably in the second half of September, we should have our data, and we will issue a press release. And then as quickly as possible after that, we will seek to present comprehensive data set in a medical conference. Some of the endpoints we won't have in time for the top line data, things like biomarkers, etc. And that's fine. That can wait. But the important bit is how much weight did they lose and what did the safety look like?
Exactly. I'm quite excited to see those results. So let's just sum up some upcoming milestones for Corbus generally. So clearly we have the phase 1b CANYON-1 obesity study results coming up now in the second half of September.
Correct.
In Q1 of 27, we have your phase 2 CRB-701 plus Keytruda. That's the combination data in first-line oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. And you also have the enrollment of patients to begin this September in your Tempo-1 registrational trial. And that's CRB-701 in monotherapy in second-line oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. And I understand that top-line results are currently anticipated in the first half of 2028. And that's exciting because you've indicated that the FDA appears to be in alignment that the objective response rates would be sufficient as a primary endpoint for potential accelerated approval. And overall survival data would be required for full approval. That's for CRB-701 in second-line oropharyngeal cancer. Just a brief corporate summary. Corbus has approximately 17.7 million common shares outstanding, 21.4 million shares on a fully diluted basis. When I last checked, Corbus shares on NASDAQ were trading in the $9 range, giving Corbus a market cap of approximately 165 million. The 52-week trading range has been a low of $7.12 and a high of $20.56. You have about 138 million cash or equivalent as of March 31, which I understand management feels is sufficient to fund the company into 2028. So Yuval, any other matters that we may have missed that you'd like to cover?
No, this has been, yet again, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for your very deep dive and the homework that you do. That makes my job on this side of the conversations really wonderful and fun. And I hope that our listeners found it of interest. We're certainly looking forward to the data.
I'm quite excited. So my disclaimer, this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered a recommendation to buy or sell securities in Corbus. Corbus is a clinical stage pre-commercial biotech company, which should be considered a high-risk investment. please do your own due diligence and speak to your financial advisor before making an investment in Corbus. And while I am independent of Corbus and not paid by them for making this podcast, I am a shareholder in Corbus, and I last purchased shares after the release of data in ASCO in late May. So with that, Yuval, thank you so much. It really was a pleasure once again.
Thank you, Steven.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.